Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're cutting through some of the noise around a really significant and often, let's face it, contentious debate. That's the president's power to deploy military forces right here on U.S. soil. We saw this flare up recently, didn't we? New Orleans Democrats really pushing back against maybe using the National Guard for crime there. And look, this isn't just some local disagreement. It's actually a critical national conversation about presidential power, public safety, and, where those lines are drawn between federal and local control. When the president talks about sending in troops, it sounds decisive, right? But what are the unseen rules, the unspoken dangers of an order like that? So that's our mission for this deep dive, exploring what we're calling the loaded weapon of presidential military authority. We're going to pull back the curtain on this immense power, look at the pressures on the military folks who have to carry out these orders, and see how these really high-stakes decisions affect everything from city governance right down to our basic constitutional principles. We want you, our listener, to really get what's at stake here.
Yeah, it's crucial we get beyond just the idea of this power and look at the actual tools. As commander-in-chief, the president has, well, a very potent tool. Some might call it dangerous. It's the Insurrection Act of 1807.
Okay, the Insurrection Act. Centuries old, you said.
Exactly. And it gives the president the unilateral authority, meaning just them to deploy active duty military and the National Guard inside the country, the stated purpose. To suppress unlawful obstructions, combinations, or assemblages or rebellion against the authority of the United States. Big words, big power.
Unilateral authority. So the president is the only one who gets to decide if something counts as an insurrection. Are there any immediate checks on that?
Well, that's really the core of it. The president makes that initial call alone. And when they do, especially combined with their other constitutional powers, they're seen as operating at the zenith of his power.
Zenith.
Yeah, it's a term from the Youngstown Framework. That's a key Supreme Court case on presidential limits. It essentially means the president is acting with implied or express congressional authorization because of the Insurrection Act. Legally, that puts them in a very strong position. It's like a shield.
And that's a big deal because it basically punches a hole in another important law, right? The Posse Comitatus Act.
Precisely. Posse Comitatus from 1878 generally says you can't use the federal military for domestic law enforcement. Keep military and civilian policing separate. But the Insurrection Act, that's the major override. It lets the president really blur those lines, step into roles usually handled by civilian police.
Wow. Okay, so it sounds incredibly broad. Almost unchecked, in a way. I've even heard legal scholars talk about some, well, pretty extreme hypotheticals. Things like, could a president use the act to order the military to, say, open fire on American protesters? Or even, as Judge Florence Pan suggested, something like assassinating political rivals. They sound wild, but I guess they highlight the sheer scale of this power.
They do sound provocative, absolutely. But those hypotheticals aren't just academic games. They're meant to show the immense authority the act grants. And they really expose the lack of clarity on what makes an order manifestly illegal. Illegal enough that a service member must refuse it. That's a huge dilemma.
A real-world dilemma with massive constitutional implications for civil liberties.
Definitely.
And we saw this tension play out very publicly, very recently, didn't we, in New Orleans, when former President Trump suggested sending the National Guard there for crime, those local Democratic leaders, they reacted pretty strongly.
Oh, absolutely. Helena Moreno, the city council president, she didn't hold back, called it scare tactics, politicizing public safety, a political stunt. She argued crime was actually way down and basically said she'd fight to prevent any federal takeover of New Orleans, a very strong defense of local control.
So you have the federal suggestion on one side and this fierce local pushback on the other. Representative Troy Carter, he represents New Orleans, he backed that up, saying militarizing the streets is not a solution. And he didn't just say no. He suggested alternatives, federal money for police training, the DA's office, even addressing systemic poverty.
And this is where it gets really interesting, politically speaking. You have Democrats making these arguments, local control, pushback against federal overreach. But those arguments sound an awful lot like traditional conservative principles, don't they? States' rights, limited federal government.
That's a fascinating point. Democrats arguing for states' rights.
It raises the question, doesn't it? Is the principle, limited government, local control, consistently applied? Or does it kind of shift depending on who's in the White House, which party is making the argument?
So are political principles becoming more flexible?
Yeah.
Maybe even transactional, based on who holds power? Or is there something else going on?
It suggests, maybe, that for some, the principle isn't absolute. It's about context, who's applying it, the immediate goal. And that inconsistency, it can erode public trust, makes it harder to have a real national conversation about the right limits of federal power, especially with something as serious as deploying troops.
Yeah, when principles seem selective, it weakens the whole debate.
Yeah. Okay, so the New Orleans situation highlights that friction between federal and local power. But let's shift gears a bit. What about the people in uniform, the ones who might actually get these orders? It can't be as simple as just follow orders, surely.
No, absolutely not. The military system is built on lawful orders, but for officers on the ground, it's way more complex, ethically complex. For one thing, most officers, even quite senior ones like majors commanding squadrons, they get surprisingly little legal training.
Really? How little?
Sometimes just one day of legal instruction in a whole 9-month program. It's often seen as inadequate. They're just not fully equipped for complex legal calls under pressure. That seems insufficient, given the potential gravity of the orders they might face.
Yeah.
What are the risks there?
Well, the risks are huge. Not only is the training potentially lacking, but the professional military education often incentivizes obedience to civilian leadership. It kind of teaches an agency approach. The military member is an agent of the executive, which can make them hesitant to question or critique guidance from the executive branch.
So obedience is emphasized over critical legal assessment.
It can lean that way. There was actually a study in 2020, quite startling. It found officers trained more heavily in obedience were more likely to comply with orders to administer shocks to someone compared to officers whose training emphasized autonomy.
Wow. That shows a direct link between training and, well, ethical decision-making under pressure.
It really does. It highlights the immense pressure to comply.
Okay, so if the line officers don't have deep legal training, what about the military lawyers, the judge advocates, the JAGs? Isn't their job?
It is, yes, and they play a vital role. But JAGs face their own hurdles. They have limited authority within the command structure, and they face real career pressures. These pressures can, unfortunately, incentivize them sometimes to find ways to legally justify the actions requested by their superior officers.
So less candid legal advice, more justification.
It can shift that way. It's been called the general counsel problem, acting more like the client's advocate than a neutral legal advisor. Plus, JAGs often work with imperfect knowledge of the actual operations. They rely on non-lawyers for the facts, which can sometimes lead to incorrect legal advice. It just adds another layer of complexity.
And the consequences of all this ambiguity, this obedience versus law tension, they can be horrific.
Yeah.
We only have to look back at something like Mile May. Lieutenant Calley ordering his troops to kill everyone, his defense, following orders.
A truly chilling example, and it's crucial to remember 2 of his subordinates refused those orders, recognizing them as manifestly illegal.
Right. And more recently.
More recently, you had the 2019 Baghuz airstrike in Syria. A JAG reported civilian deaths. The command apparently took no action. A military probe later found no wrongdoing, but then a New York Times investigation revealed the U.S. had hit an airstrike that killed dozens of civilians.
So accountability can just evaporate.
It shows how internal mechanisms can fail, how accountability can be obscured. And this points to another danger, politicization. As Walter Haynes warned, when individuals inside a traditionally apolitical institution like the military become more politicized, it can really damage cohesion and effectiveness. That's incredibly risky when you're talking about domestic deployment.
Okay, so internal challenges within the military itself. But the executive branch has its own legal support system, doesn't it? The Office of Legal Counsel, OLC.
That's right. The OLC, part of the Justice Department, they provide legal advice to the executive branch. And their opinions carry enormous weight. They function almost like binding judicial precedent within the executive branch.
Binding precedent, wow.
But here's the critical part. Critics argue the OLC often works to find a legal justification for what the executive branch wants to do, rather than giving purely objective, candid advice. That dynamic can enable presidents to stretch their power because they have an official legal rationale, even if it's debatable.
And this seems to tie directly into the whole debate around presidential criminal immunity.
It does.
With courts, like in Trump v. United States, suggesting presidents might have absolute criminal immunity for official acts within their constitutional authority. If you combine that potential immunity with OLC opinions providing justification, does that create a kind of veneer of legality?
That's exactly the concern raised. It potentially allows a president to act at that zenith of his power we talked about, shielded by both OLC opinions and this idea of absolute criminal immunity. It builds a pretty strong legal fortress.
A fortress making accountability much harder.
Precisely. And this concentration of power, this legal shielding, it affects broader conversations about governance and justice, too. Think about how the term authoritarian gets used. Sometimes it seems to be applied most often when a leader challenges established institutions, civil service, universities, media.
You mean it might be used defensively by those groups?
Some argue it can function that way, yeah.
Yeah.
As a kind of class protection mechanism rather than a purely objective measure of democratic health. If the label itself becomes political, how does that help us evaluate a president using something like the Insurrection Act?
That's a really interesting point about language. And we're seeing shifts in tactics too, aren't we? Things once maybe associated more with the left, like digging up old controversial statements, outrage archaeology, or retroactive shaming.
Now being used just as much by the right against progressives, it becomes symmetrical.
Right. And does that just turn accountability into a weapon, where everyone's focused on exposing hypocrisy instead of debating the actual substance?
It certainly risks that. It can create a climate where real discussion about governance, about the proper use of power, gets drowned out by partisan point scoring. And this politicization, this strain, it shows up in our justice system too, which, ironically, can fuel calls for federal intervention.
How so?
Look at Chicago. The city's paid out over $700 million since 2000 for overturned convictions, often based on policing irregularities, not necessarily proven innocence. These certificates of innocence have become, well, a cash cow for some law firms, draining city funds and creating weird financial incentives around reversals.
$700 million, that's staggering.
That's so.
And it suggests deep problems at the local level.
It does. And when local systems seem broken, it erodes confidence. That can lead to calls for decisive action, maybe federal action. But as we've discussed, that federal action carries its own huge risks.
It's a tough trade-off. Perceived local failure versus the dangers of federal overreach.
Exactly. And it's not just Chicago. Massachusetts has a 15-year time limit on prosecuting adult rape, even if DNA evidence turns up later. Basically, nullifying modern forensic advances, denying justice.
And crime statistics. The overall numbers often hide the real story. Like in D.C., where over 7 years, Black residents were homicide victims 97 times more often per capita than white residents.
97 times. It shows crime is incredibly hyper-concentrated. So broad crime up-down, talk misses who is actually bearing the danger. We need targeted, effective policing, not just blunt federal tools.
Which military intervention often is a blunt tool.
Right, and shifting gears slightly, even economic narratives play into this. Some argue recent job and GDP gains might be partly a sugar high, inflated by a surge in unauthorized workers.
So as enforcement tightens, growth might slow, but it's just normalization, not a real downturn.
That's the argument, a need for careful analysis. But economic anxiety, real or perceived, can also fuel calls for strong presidential action, maybe even emergency measures.
It all connects back to that central question of power and its limits. And, hearing from some self-identified conservatives, say on Reddit, is insightful here. Many say they feel misunderstood. They believe in true conservative ideas, more local autonomy, states' rights, the Constitution.
But they feel frustrated by, quote, mega actions that seem to contradict those principles, calling it a cult focused on loyalty to Trump over things like states' rights or due process.
That internal conflict seems significant.
It really does. They talk about wanting sanity again, getting back to issue-based conversations, not just constant trolling and demonization. This internal tension within a major party is important. If a party that champions limited government seems to abandon that when their leader is in power, it weakens the ability to consistently challenge potential overreach from any president. It's a call for principles over personality.
Which is vital for accountability. So we've seen the immense power of the presidency, especially this loaded weapon of domestic military deployment. It's clear. But the long-term health of our republic, it seems to hinge not just on whether an order is technically legal, but on the wisdom behind it, the integrity of how it's carried out, and crucially, an unwavering commitment to constitutional principles from everyone involved. So the question we leave you with is this: how do we as citizens make sure accountability stays paramount? Especially when we face calls for swift, decisive action and navigate all these complexities, legal shields, political shifts, internal military pressures. Something to think about.